You're listening to NAPAbroadcasting.com.
Thanks for joining us here at NAPAbroadcasting.com. Our guest today, Mike Basayne, has spent 9 years on the Napa Planning Commission. He has seen a lot of projects come and go during that period, everything from Napa Pipe to Walt Ranch to debates about helicopters, and some projects older than that, some things that we've forgotten about along the way. He is leaving the Planning Commission. In fact, last week was his last meeting, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to have Mike here with us to look back at the 9 years he spent on the Planning Commission, talk a little bit about what he's going to do next, and more importantly, about what he has seen change and grow during those 9 years. Mike Basayne, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
9 years on the Planning Commission is a long time. What are you going to do with your Wednesdays now?
Well, I'm sure I'll find something to fill the gap. There's always something to do.
Seriously, why now? Why did you want to leave the Planning Commission at this point?
Well, firstly, I need to let you know I'm not disgruntled, and I'd like to think that I'm leaving on a good note. Mm-hmm. And when I write my tell-all story, just know that you'll have the exclusive.
Thank you.
I would say that although there are people in public service who may have served longer than my 9 years in their respective positions, it really was time for me to move on and allow other people to have a chance to put their signature on the process and provide a new perspective. And I know whoever is picked to replace me, the change can be healthy, and that the new leader will be most likely the right person at the right time. But it was really time for me to move on and look at other options. Certainly, moving forward, I may take a break, but I'm interested in community service and in pursuing possibly other commission positions and or board positions. I haven't ruled out the possibility of running for office down the road, but I'm not sure what or when.
You've considered running for office. It's been widely reported over the years, and in fact, I think made a run for the appointed council seat when Alfredo Pedroza left the city council. Talk a little bit about your interest in public service and really your desire to continue to stay involved and the possibility that you might run for elected office at some point.
Certainly. Well, I like to think that it's not ego-driven. I sincerely believe that public service is a commitment to serve the community that you live in and to do so faithfully. And I was raised in a family where public service was non-negotiable. And that really was both on my dad's side, my mom's side. They were involved in any number of different activities that included both government and private sector activities that supported the community. So I would say it's been in my DNA. I did move to Napa 35 years ago, and I've been involved in a number of different nonprofit boards, certainly related to my kids growing up, but also giving back to youth and being involved in certainly the business community and so forth. But I happen to really care for this community, and it's interesting that when I left San Francisco 35 years ago and I moved to Napa as a young banker, I did so because Napa had a wonderful sense of place. It certainly was a community where, it was reported in the Napa Register when I was interviewed that I believed that it was a great place to get to know your neighbors and certainly raise your kids. And it's a community that certainly, as I see it, will continue to need guidance and commitment. And if and when I do run for office, I'd certainly like to have a hand in continuing to make decisions that influence outcomes in a positive way.
Talk about the ways in which you've seen Napa change, both as somebody that's been here for 35 years, but also even in the 9 years that you spent on the Planning Commission. A lot has changed, even in some of the areas you just touched on.
Well, certainly. When I did first move here, it felt like a very provincial community. And if you didn't go to high school in Napa, you were sort of an outsider. And I felt that immediately because I was involved in banking, and it was for a small community bank, Napa Valley Bank, and so there were a number of people who had been born and raised in Napa who knew Napa from years gone by and were comparing and contrasting the Napa of 1983 to the Napa of 1945. And so certainly we've had this wonderful sense of being a rural environment where agriculture has influenced the economy and our behaviors. But as is the case with any growing environment that has multiple attractions, and in our case, certainly the tourist industry continued to evolve by virtue of the number of wineries that had been approved, and certainly the proliferation of hotels and hospitality. The landscape began to evolve and change and morph and accommodate more businesses, and it began to look more and more like a suburban environment relative to the greater Bay Area rather than a last frontier or a hamlet hidden in the hinterlands. And so we continue now, and over the last 9 years, to be influenced by outside forces. But now, of course, we've become the outside force in many respects. We have certainly a much more abundant means of communicating and receiving information, and certainly we've been influenced by the advent of technology. And needless to say, we are now a community that has, I believe it's 50,000 more residents than we did in 1990. And although we aren't the fastest growing region in the Bay Area, we continue to grow and suffer the growing pains that are representative of a healthy economy.
When you look around Napa, talk about the ways in which you think, as a county, and even in the city a little bit, but the ways in which we're better than we were 10, 15 years ago.
Well, what I have seen that has continued to impress me, certainly on the government side, is an aspiration for best practices and a sense of a need for continuous improvement and a need for circumspection and review of our behaviors. And I think that certainly the people who we have in leadership positions in the county and in the cities can be attributed to that sense of continuous improvement and the higher bar that is set for our behaviors, whether it's for design review relative to real estate development, making sure that we're very, very thoughtful and deliberate about how we design our environment here. And clearly, we have been one of the most regulated environments, I believe, in certainly our agricultural watershed and preserve relative to any other county, relative to any other state, it seems, where we've tried to continue to raise the bar, perform the best practices, and make sure that what we've set in terms of our vision and mission, that we've achieved it, and or continue to work to achieve it. And that may sound somewhat vague, but I certainly believe that all we have to do is really look around and see how growth has been largely, certainly in terms of housing, has been largely confined to the cities. We've really tried our very best to execute the general plan as we've laid it forth, and certainly we revisit the general plan frequently, and certainly elements of it, such now as the most recently the county's traffic circulation plan. We try to revisit these processes often, and therefore I believe we're better at what we do. And it just seems, looking back to that 35-year mark when I first arrived, there wasn't the same level of, I would say, care or enforcement relative to making sure that things were done right in the county. And I think we can certainly be satisfied that we're continuing to improve and do good things.
Do you think there are ways in which things have gotten worse?
Well, certainly the number one, I guess, pain point that we suffer that is most clear to us is that the deleterious effect of success is most easily manifest in terms of traffic, the lack of housing that we have available to our service community, as well as others who earn less than what it takes to purchase a home in our community. And some would argue that certainly we've come close to a tipping point with respect to the number of wineries that have been approved in the county. And so the landscape, the visual landscape, is very different from what it was many years ago. But that also includes not just structures, but it includes traffic. And certainly we know that a large percentage of that traffic is not necessarily tourist-based, but relates to individuals who are commuting within our roadways, and that we aren't necessarily interested in putting a 6-lane highway in place of Highway 29. We're much more interested in preserving the rural character of our environment, and therefore we have multiple pinch points that cause that traffic to back up and make things more difficult to move around.
When you think back over those 9 years, it's interesting. You talk about a tipping point, and some people that argue that there are too many wineries, perhaps. Was there a point in those 9 years when you realized that we had crossed the Rubicon, when we were moving in a certain direction, and that there was really no turning around at that point?
Well, I would say that certainly looking back over 9 years, there were, I guess at this point, close to 200 applications that I looked at, and the behavior was such that we were certainly trying to do our very best to make sure that we vetted the agreements and proposals properly, that we were certainly trying to make sure that we were doing the right thing. And I would say that the activity began to slow during the recessionary years, but then pick up towards maybe 2012, 2013, and the sense that there was perhaps more disagreement or more pushback from folks in our community who may not have represented the majority, but certainly represented dissatisfaction with the process. One particular application that comes to mind is the Yountville Hill application in Yountville, which, as you may recall, was about a 10-acre project that would have possibly had to source grapes from other locations. It would have disturbed the view shed. And what I think became abundantly clear to me was, and the commission was split on this particular vote, as you may recall, but it was very clear to me that the community was not necessarily at that point accepting or comfortable at all with this continued approval of just any winery. And so at that point, I remember that we were certainly faced with a great deal of vociferous dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the way in which the Board of Supervisors itself, and the way you've seen it change. When you first got on the Planning Commission, it was a much older board. It was a very different board than the Board of Supervisors we have today.
Yes, I certainly with the election of Supervisor Gregory, Supervisor Pedrosa, and Supervisor Ramos, we've seen great leadership. I believe that there has been an employment of social media sources, unlike we've seen in the past. They are engaged and engaging. They try to involve themselves in many, many activities in the community, certainly with respect to the wildfire that occurred back in October. Belia Ramos was tested as a community leader, stepped up to the challenge, and was highly energized. Really, I think was much more engaged than I had seen in the past. And part of that has to do, I think, with youthful energy, but I think also just a great sense of commitment to the community. And we're certainly seeing a strong effort to listen to community members. And some may disagree, but I continue to be impressed with the effort that all of our supervisors make, but certainly with regard to just sort of the sea change that you're referring to, I think there's a much higher level of engagement than there may have been in the past, or not at all to disparage prior supervisors, because we've had some great leadership over the years, but just a very active sense of community engagement.
And how is that filtered down to impact the Planning Commission?
Well, certainly we have Planning Commission appointees, and yet really the newest one is Joelle Gallagher. She's with Brad Wagenknecht. She's a newer planning commissioner with a more established supervisor. But I would say that one thing that has always impressed me is the objectivity that the Board of Supervisors employs with the Planning Commission, the sense that we live with our decisions as a planning commission, and there's a high level of confidence that has heretofore been there in the members of the Planning Commission. So I would say that if anything, the relationships have been solid between the Planning Commission and the supervisors, and if anything, the dialogue is there. But again, the accountability is really on the shoulders of the individual planning commissioners.
What's frustrated you personally the most in the job?
Well, it's interesting because certainly we've had marathon sessions, and that comes with the territory, and the duration of any particular meeting is really a function of the schedule. But I think we have really benefited from a committed county staff who has tried to get reports into our hands at least 4 or 5 days before any particular meeting. That isn't always possible. And certainly one of the challenges is that we may get a data dump at the very last minute where we've had to ferret through 200 pages at 11 o'clock the evening before the event. And one may say that it also comes with the territory, but it really is, I think, in many respects, a disservice to people who have to make the decisions. It may be unavoidable, and certainly, I think it's one of those things that comes with the territory. But I would say that what we aspired to achieve was more consistent distribution of information, the ability to take our time to review the applications, to perform the site visits, and to do our homework so that we are the best that we can possibly be when it comes to that meeting day.
Many of those document dumps that come at the last minute have often come from opponents of projects as a way to delay things. That's become almost a kind of tactic.
Yeah, I would probably use a more diplomatic word if I could, but it is a technique that certainly isn't just employed in our venue. It is something that I've certainly read about and seen used in other venues, and it can certainly derail a project, and that's where we really have to use our sense of discernment and whether or not we would need to continue a hearing, whether or not we'd need to take an abundant reading break. But it can be used to require the commission to take a step back and further digest what is going on.
Do you have a sense that the debates about some of these projects, especially the more controversial ones, have gotten more mean-spirited, that they've gotten angrier, that they've gotten more personal? Some people have made that case lately.
Yeah, so that's a very good point, and it seems to me that just given the tenor of our times, we've seen more posturing, and some would argue that this preserves the balance of activity and keeps government in check. I think it's always been important to ask questions, but one just needs to be careful not to vilify, or whether it's an industry or individuals. And it seems to me that yes, the behaviors have for a period of time were becoming more pointed and directed at individuals, and I think it quite possibly relates to a fear of change. I think that again, sort of harkening back to our times and the tenor of the times, I would say that on a more global level, politically, we've had more divisiveness, and that's really filtered down to the local level. And so we see this now in Measure C, where we have folks who are certainly not hesitant to be passionate or express in a very emotional way their perspective, but it's such that we certainly shouldn't be attacking individuals by virtue of having a different perspective.
Regardless of how Measure C turns out, there are a lot of people that are saying that this is some kind of a turning point. Do you see that, or is that just part of the heated rhetoric of the moment?
I would tend to agree with the latter. I think that we're certainly at a point where we continue to, over time, try to tweak this process of evaluating best practices. And yes, we are experiencing greater levels of traffic. We are experiencing more development in the county. There is this concern that our watershed is being challenged, the quality of our water, and so forth. But I also think that certainly we're looking at a perspective that is just simply challenging the status quo. And again, getting back to really, the notion of tweaking and employing best practices. We continue to be one of the most highly regulated agricultural environments, again, if not in the state, in the nation. And so to see Measure C pass at this point, I think potentially it would not be based in fact, and certainly we've heard any number of arguments against it by virtue of the multiple media touches. But I really feel at this point that it's overkill.
What are you going to miss most about being on the Planning Commission, Mike?
Well, certainly, I have a very high level of respect for my colleagues on the commission, and I've really enjoyed being part of the decision-making process that does influence outcomes in the county, and it has been a pleasure working with my colleagues. I would say it's certainly been a pleasure being engaged with the public and hearing perspectives on all sides of the equation. And I've developed also a healthy respect for the opinions of others and the importance of listening. And I will miss those relationships, and I just hope to rekindle them as I pursue other opportunities.
Talk about finally the switch you made. I mean, you were involved in finance and banking for many, many years and got involved in the public service aspects we talked about before. Talk about the skills that have been, first of all, coextensive to both, and really the learning curve that you may still be on in terms of understanding all of this.
Well, again, going back to my banking career that evolved into a consulting career where I had worked for a company called the Rainier Group out of Bellevue, Washington. And then, of course, we went through the trials and tribulations. I like to say I was a happy participant in the Great Recession. And that also allowed me to be a business advisor with the Small Business Development Center at Napa Valley College, and I still am a business advisor with Napa Valley College and the Small Business Development Center and the Small Business Administration. But I think that in terms of the skill set, it really relates to one's ability to be a trusted advisor and to listen, to be able to strategize, to be able to provide solutions to problems. The banking background, the MBA, certainly the business advisor activities has given me a great sense of the numbers, and I understand certainly finance, but I also really feel that as I move forward, as I continue to morph and age myself, that I would want to be viewed as someone who can be a great advocate and someone who can also be a great friend, but really somebody who is committed to the health of our community.
And are there any votes as you look back on those 9 years? Are there votes that you wish, gee, I wish I could do that again, things you'd like to take back?
Well, there are always things that we like to take back. However, I would say that I really feel that, sort of relative to what we were talking about with Yountville Hill, that was a very, very challenging, questioned decision, and I think certainly given new circumstances and or information, the vote may have been different. I'm second guessing myself at this point, but I do believe that we can always be better at what we do. We can't always control the outcome, but we certainly can do our best to make sure that we're working within what we can control. And so I do believe that with every decision that we've made, we put the sweat into it and the elbow grease, and we may have ended up being a bit bruised in the process individually, but regardless of what the decisions are, but it's been a fun and great experience.
What was the most contentious experience, the most contentious debate that you were part of on there?
Golly, it seemed that there were quite a few. I would say that in recent years, the Mountain Peak Winery really brought out a great deal of just very disturbed, very emotional residents who felt that enough was enough, and I felt that certainly those concerns were justified in many respects, but I would say that is certainly an application that stood out.
Mike Basayne, I thank you so much for spending time with us and tripping down memory lane a little bit with us.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to NAPAbroadcasting.com. Napa Valley Radio for the way we live now.